The fluorescent lights of Metropolitan General hummed with a sterile, aggressive energy that always seemed to vibrate in the back of Ozioma Nandi's skull. It was 6 a.m., the transitional hour where the exhaustion of the night shift collided with the sharp, caffeinated arrogance of the morning surgical rounds. Ozioma stood at the periphery of the group, her posture so still she almost blurred into the white-painted walls. She was a woman of shadows and silence. Her dark skin framed by the stark white of her scrubs, her eyes focused not on the doctors, but on the subtle rise and fall of the patient's chest in bed 4. Dr. Victor Clifford, the head of surgery, led the procession like a king traversing a conquered land. His lab coat was pressed to a razor's edge, and his voice carried the booming resonance of a man who had never been told he was wrong. He stopped at the foot of the bed, barely glancing at the charts Ozioma held with steady, scarred hands. "Status on the pulmonary bypass patient, nurse?" Clifford asked, though he didn't wait for her to speak. He turned to the gaggle of residents trailing behind him, a smirk playing on his lips. "And try to use your words today, Nandi. I know the concept of verbal communication is a bit advanced for you." A few of the residents chuckled, a sycophantic, hollow sound. Jessica, the head floor nurse who lived for Clifford's approval, leaned in with a whisper loud enough for the entire ward to hear. "Don't expect much, doctor. She's been in a trance since midnight. I honestly think she's more of a decorative fixture than a medical professional at this point." Ozioma didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself. In the specialized world she had left behind, ego was a liability that got people killed. She had been the asset, a woman whose hands could rebuild a shattered torso in the back of a moving Humvee while under heavy fire. To her, Clifford's petty insults felt like pebbles thrown at a tank. She simply extended the chart, her voice a low, calm murmur. "Vitals are stable, doctor. However, the patient's oxygen saturation has dipped 3% in the last hour. I've noted a slight arrhythmia in the lower chambers." Clifford didn't even take the chart. He let out a theatrical sigh, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. 3%. My God, Nandi. Do you spend your entire shift staring at the monitors, waiting for a decimal point to move? It's called recovery. Look at her, she's fine. But I suppose when you lack the ambition to actually understand the science, you cling to the numbers like a life raft. He stepped closer, invading Ozioma's personal space. He was a head taller, using his physical stature to emphasize the hierarchy. "That's the problem with you. No drive. No spark. You're content to be a ghost, drifting through these halls, doing the bare minimum while the real doctors do the heavy lifting. You have the hands of a technician, but the mind of a clerk." Ozioma looked up then, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her eyes were unreadable, deep, dark pools that had seen things Clifford couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares. She saw the way his pulse jumped in his neck, a sign of high blood pressure and an even higher ego. She could have told him exactly why the patient's heart was staggering, but she knew he wouldn't listen. To him, she was just a quiet nurse with no ambition, a woman who had peaked at the bedside. "I am here to serve the patient, Dr. Clifford," she said softly. "You're here to follow my lead," he snapped, snatching the folder from her hands and nearly knocking it to the floor. "Try to keep up. Or at least try to look like you're awake. It's embarrassing for the department to have a statue on the payroll." As the group swept away, Clifford's laughter echoed down the hallway. Ozioma remained by the bed, her hands finally moving, not in a tremble of fear, but in a precise, practiced check of the 4-line. She was a ghost, yes. But ghosts had a way of seeing everything, and Ozioma knew that before the sun reached its zenith, the hierarchy Clifford loved so much was going to crumble. For now, she would wait. She was a soldier, and she knew better than anyone that the quietest moment always preceded the storm. The morning light began to bleed through the blinds of the intensive care unit, casting long, skeletal shadows across the linoleum. The hospital was waking up, a beast of bureaucracy and ego, but Ozioma Nandi remained in the stillness she had perfected over a decade of service. Dr. Clifford and his entourage had moved on to the next wing, their laughter still echoing faintly like the fading embers of a fire. Ozioma, however, did not move. She remained at the bedside of Mrs. Gable. The pulmonary bypass patient Clifford had just declared fine. Clifford saw a recovery in progress. Ozioma saw a ticking clock. Her eyes, trained in the brutal triage of forward operating bases where a second's hesitation meant a body bag, traced the patient's jugular vein. There it was, a rhythmic, almost imperceptible fluttering. It wasn't just the 3% dip in oxygen. It was the way the patient's right hand twitched. A micro-tremor that signaled a neurological storm brewing deep beneath the surface. Clifford had mocked her for staring at decimal points, but Ozioma knew that in medicine, as in war, the smallest details were the most lethal. Without a word, Ozioma bypassed the standard floor protocols. She knew the bureaucracy would demand a senior resident's approval for a specialized scan, but she also knew Mrs. Gable didn't have 30 minutes for a committee meeting. She moved with a fluid, silent efficiency, her hands, the ones Clifford called technician's hands, adjusting the foredrip and prepping a portable ultrasound. She didn't call for help. She didn't make a scene. She simply worked. As the graining imaging appeared on the screen, her suspicions were confirmed. A tiny, rogue blood clot was dancing at the edge of the pulmonary artery, ready to migrate. It was a silent killer, the kind of complication that would lead to a sudden, catastrophic arrest that Clifford would later write off as unavoidable. Ozioma reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, non-standard medical kit she always kept close, a relic of her time as a combat medic. She didn't perform surgery, but she administered a precise, high-dose anticoagulant bolus through the central line, timed to the millisecond of the patient's heart rate. It was a move of extreme clinical daring, one that required a level of expertise Clifford didn't even believe she possessed. Slowly, the flutter in the jugular subsided. The oxygen monitor ticked upward, 96, 97, 98%. The storm had been averted before the first drop of rain even fell. 10 minutes later, Clifford returned, his face flushed with the pride of a successful morning. He marched over to Mrs. Gable's bed, glancing at the monitor with an air of triumph. "See, look at those numbers," Clifford shouted, gesturing to the residents who had followed him back. "The saturation is back to 99%. I told you, Nandi. The body just needs a firm hand and a doctor who knows how to lead. My surgical technique on the bypass was so precise that the recovery is ahead of schedule." He patted the patient's hand, looking like a savior in a white lab coat. "I'll be noting in the chart that my post-op management corrected the minor fluctuations the nursing staff was worried about." Ozioma stood back in the shadows, her face a mask of ironclad discipline. She didn't mention the ultrasound. She didn't mention the bolus she had administered. She didn't point out that his management had consisted of an insult and a shrug. "Yes, doctor," she said, her voice a calm, hollow reed. "The patient is stable now." Clifford puffed out his chest, the embodiment of institutional arrogance. "Of course she is. Maybe if you watched me more closely, you'd learn that medicine is about decisive action, not quiet observation." He walked away, taking the credit for a life he had almost let slip through his fingers. Ozioma simply adjusted the patient's blanket, tucking the edges in with a tenderness that no one noticed. She didn't need the credit. She needed the patient to live. She was the silent savior, the ghost in the machine, and as she watched Clifford's retreating back, she knew the decisive action he prided himself on was about to meet a force he couldn't possibly understand. The asset was still hidden, but her work was done. The afternoon brought the chaos Ozioma had sensed in the humidity of the morning. A multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate turned the ER into a triage ward of screaming sirens and red-coated trauma. Amidst the frenzy, Dr. Clifford was in his element, barking orders and relishing the frantic energy. But when a young man was wheeled in, pale, thready pulse, and a jagged piece of rebar protruding from his femoral artery, the room's temperature seemed to drop. The bleeding was catastrophic. Clifford was already over the patient, his hands slick with crimson as he tried to apply a standard arterial clamp. "I can't get a purchase. The vessel is retracting into the muscle," he roared, his voice cracking with a rare note of panic. "Get me more suction. I can't see the field." Ozioma stood on the opposite side of the gurney, while Clifford struggled with the metal instruments. She saw what he couldn't. The artery hadn't just retracted. It was shredded in a way that traditional clamping would only worsen. In her mind, the sterile ER vanished, replaced by the dust and heat of a Kandahar roadside. She didn't think, she transitioned. She reached into the wound. Her fingers, usually so still and submissive, moved with a terrifying, calculated precision. She performed a blind digital ligation, a redacted battlefield maneuver used only when surgical tools were useless and the patient was seconds from bleeding out. She didn't just apply pressure. She hooked the vessel with a specific twist of her knuckle. pinning the artery against the pelvic bone from the inside. The geyser of blood stopped instantly. The room went silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. Clifford froze, his eyes darting from the dry surgical field to Ozioma's hand buried deep in the patient's thigh. For 3 seconds, he was stunned. Then, the embarrassment of being saved by a clerk ignited into a blinding rage. "What do you think you're doing?" Clifford screamed, his face inches from hers. "Get your hands out of there. You've just contaminated a surgical field with a non-standard, unapproved physical intervention. Do you have any idea how many protocols you just shattered?" "The artery was shredded, doctor," Ozioma said, her voice like cool stone. "A clamp would have severed it completely. He would have been dead before you finished your sentence. I don't care if you think you're a miracle worker." Clifford shrieked, his ego hemorrhaging faster than the patient ever had. "This is a hospital, not a back alley clinic. You are a nurse, Nandi. You do not touch, you do not improvise. And you certainly do not perform cowboy medicine on my watch." He shoved a resident forward to take over the manual pressure, forcing Ozioma to retract her hand. The patient was stable enough for the oar, but Clifford wasn't interested in the save. He was interested in the insubordination. He looked at the blood on Ozioma's scrubs as if it were a personal insult. "Go to my office," Clifford hissed, pointing a trembling finger toward the exit. "Right now. Do not speak to the staff. Do not touch another patient." Ozioma walked out of the trauma bay, the adrenaline leaving her body in a controlled, cold wave. She sat in the silence of the administrative wing, watching through the glass as Clifford stormed toward the chief of staff's office. She could see him through the window, gesturing wildly, his mouth moving in a silent tirade. 10 minutes later, he emerged, a manila folder in his hand. He didn't walk, he marched. He slammed the folder down on the desk in front of her. On the top, in bold, aggressive red ink, were the words, "Termination of employment." "You're done," Clifford said, his voice trembling with a dark satisfaction. "I've spent months trying to find a reason to get rid of your dead weight, and you just gave me a gift-wrapped excuse. Gross negligence. Violation of surgical protocol. You'll never work in a hospital in this city again." Ozioma looked at the letter, then up at Clifford. For the first time, she didn't look down. She didn't hunch her shoulders. She stood up, and for a fleeting second, Clifford stepped back, instinctively reacting to a predator he hadn't known was in the room. "I saved that man's life, Victor," she said, dropping the formal title for the first time. "You're a liability," he spat back. "Now get out of my sight before I have security drag you out." Ozioma picked up the folder. She didn't look defeated. She looked like someone who had just been relieved of a heavy, unnecessary burden. She walked toward the lobby, the termination letter in hand, unaware that the world she had tried to hide from was currently pulling into the hospital driveway with the roar of a dozen engines. The lobby of Metropolitan General was a cavernous space of glass and polished stone, designed to project an image of healing and order. But as Ozioma Nandi walked toward the sliding glass doors, the atmosphere felt more like a public execution. Dr. Victor Clifford had followed her out of the administrative wing, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the tile, drawing the eyes of every visiting family member and off-duty staffer in the vicinity. "Stop right there. Nandi." Clifford's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. He wasn't content with a private dismissal. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to ensure that his authority was reaffirmed in the most public way possible. Ozioma stopped. She didn't turn around with the frantic energy of a woman losing her livelihood. She pivoted slowly, her movements economical and precise. She looked at him with a level of detachment that seemed to infuriate him more than any argument could. Clifford caught up to her, his face a mottled shade of crimson. He brandished the manila folder like a weapon, waving it inches from her nose. "You think you can just walk out after what you did? You're lucky I'm not calling the police for assault on a patient." He turned to the growing crowd of onlookers, nurses, orderlies, and interns who had paused their shifts to witness the downfall of the quiet nurse. "Take a good look, everyone. This is what happens when you decide that your intuition is more important than medical law. This woman is a danger to this institution." Ozioma remained unnervingly calm. Her hands were folded loosely in front of her, the same hands that had been buried in a man's thigh moments ago to keep his soul from leaking onto an ER floor. She watched the vein throbbing in Clifford's temple. She analyzed his posture, leaning forward, weight on his toes, chin jutting out, an amateur's display of dominance. "The patient is alive, Victor," she said, her voice low but carrying an incredible weight. "That is the only metric that matters. The metric is the law. The metric is the hierarchy." Clifford roared, slamming the termination folder against his open palm. "You are a nobody. You are a footnote in this hospital's history. You have no standing, no reputation, and after today, no future. I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that I am the one who stripped those scrubs off your back." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a venomous hiss that only she could hear. "I knew you were a fraud the second you walked in here with that quiet professional act. You're just a broken soldier who couldn't cut it, trying to play doctor in my house." Ozioma didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The insults were white noise. To her, Clifford was a small man in a large coat, shouting at a mountain and wondering why the mountain didn't tremble. "Is that all?" she asked quietly. Clifford's mouth fell open. He expected tears, or perhaps a desperate plea for her pension. The lack of reaction was an insult to his ego that he couldn't process. "Is that?" "No, it isn't all. Security," he barked, looking toward the front desk. "Escort this woman out, and if she ever sets foot on this property again, have her arrested for trespassing." Two security guards approached, looking uncomfortable. They knew Ozioma. She was the only nurse who ever brought them coffee during the graveyard shifts. "Nurse Nandi, please," one of them whispered, reaching for her arm. "I can walk myself out, Ben," she said gently, her eyes never leaving Clifford's. She turned back toward the glass doors, the termination letter held at her side like a folded flag. She was prepared to walk into the anonymity of the afternoon sun, to let the quiet nurse die and find another place to serve. But as she took her first step toward the exit, a sudden, low-frequency rumble began to shake the glass panels of the lobby. It wasn't the sound of an ambulance. It was the synchronized roar of high-performance engines and the rhythmic wail of federal sirens. Clifford smirked, assuming the police had arrived to hasten her departure. "Looks like your ride is here, Nandi." Early for once. Ozioma didn't answer. She looked through the glass, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the formation of the black SUVs screaming into the ambulance bay. The storm hadn't just arrived, it was breaching the perimeter. The rumble wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force that rattled the high-domed windows of the lobby and vibrated in the marrow of everyone present. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the ambulance bay, usually a place of sterile white vans and patient unloading, was suddenly choked by a fleet of 6 identical pitch-black SUVs. They didn't slow down. They moved in a synchronized V formation, tires screeching against the asphalt as they drifted into a hard-stop perimeter that effectively cordoned off the hospital's entire front entrance. The lobby went silent. Dr. Clifford, still clutching the termination folder, looked toward the doors with a mix of confusion and irritation. What in the hell is this? An oversized motorcade? They're blocking the emergency lane. But as the sirens let out one final aggressive chirp, the doors of the lead vehicles swung open with military precision. 8 men in tailored charcoal suits and dark sunglasses stepped out simultaneously. They didn't move like police officers. They moved with the lethal, predatory grace of federal agents on a live-wire mission. They weren't looking for directions. They were securing a zone. Ozioma stood her ground, her back to the glass. She didn't need to look. She knew the sound of those engines, the specific click of the radio earpieces, and the heavy thud of tactical boots. The termination letter in her hand felt lighter now, a discarded relic of a life that was currently being overwritten by a much larger reality. 2 of the agents stepped toward the sliding glass doors. The hospital's sensors were too slow for their pace. So one agent simply placed a hand on the frame and forced the heavy glass panels back, overriding the motor with a mechanical groan. The seal was broken. The outside world, the world Ozioma had spent years trying to keep at bay, flooded into the lobby. Dr. Clifford stepped forward, his face twisting back into its customary mask of arrogance. "Now see here. You can't just force your way into a medical facility. I am the head of surgery. And I demand to know," the lead agent, a man with a jawline like a granite block and a silver lapel pin that caught the sterile lobby light, didn't even break his stride. He moved past Clifford as if the doctor were a piece of decorative furniture. His focus was locked entirely on the woman in the stained scrubs. The staff watched, breathless. As the perimeter agents fanned out, their hands hovering near their jackets, their eyes scanning the balconies and corridors with terrifying intensity. The hospital security guards, who had been ready to escort Ozioma out, instinctively stepped back, their hands raised in a universal gesture of non-interference. They knew a superior force when they saw one. The lead agent stopped exactly 3 feet from Ozioma. He didn't look at her termination letter. He didn't look at the blood on her sleeve from the trauma bay. He snapped his heels together and offered a sharp, crisp salute, the kind of salute reserved for officers who had earned it in blood and bone. "Lieutenant Commander Nandi," the agent said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that cut through the hospital's remaining hum. "The situation has escalated. We're 10 minutes out from a Category 1 arrival." Ozioma's posture changed. The slight slouch of the quiet nurse vanished, replaced by a spine of tempered steel. Her chin lifted, and for the first time, the people in the lobby saw the woman Clifford had tried to bury. She didn't look like a fired employee. She looked like a commander receiving a sitrep. "Agent Bush," she acknowledged, her voice no longer a whisper but a command. "I assume the witness is in transit?" "He's in the second bird, 3 minutes out," Bush replied, ignoring the sputtering Dr. Clifford, who was now standing frozen with the manila folder halfway to his chest. "We've cleared the roof, but we need you on the floor. You're the only one on the manifest for this procedure, ma'am." Ozioma glanced back at Clifford, then down at the termination folder. She didn't smile, but there was a cold, clinical light in her eyes that made the doctor's blood run cold. She handed the folder back to him, her fingers brushing the paper one last time. "It looks like I won't be needing my locker cleared out today, Victor," she said. "I have work to do." The silence in the lobby was absolute, a vacuum created by the sheer gravity of the federal presence. Dr. Victor Clifford stood paralyzed, the termination folder still clutched in his hand like a useless shield. He looked from the stone-faced agents to the woman he had spent months demeaning, waiting for someone to explain why the world had suddenly inverted. Agent Marcus Bush didn't offer that explanation. To him, Clifford didn't exist. The doctor was merely an obstacle in the line of sight between a protector and his objective. Bush reached into the lead SUV, pulling out a garment bag that appeared as crisp and lethal as the men carrying it. "We were told you were keeping a low profile, ma'am," Bush said, his voice dropping the formal volume, but retaining its ironclad respect. But the director was clear. If the situation went kinetic, we were to bring the suit. The hospital's administrative access has already been overridden. Your credentials as a Level 5 federal medical asset are active as of 30 seconds ago. He handed the garment bag to Ozioma. She took it with a single, firm tug. Inside was a tailored black suit, the uniform of the unseen. It was a signal that the quiet nurse was dead, and the lieutenant commander had returned to the front lines. "Give me 3 minutes," Ozioma said. She didn't ask permission. She issued an order. 3 minutes, ma'am," Bush replied, stepping back to let her pass. As Ozioma turned toward the staff locker rooms, Clifford finally found his voice, though it sounded thin and high-pitched in the presence of the Secret Service detail. "Now, wait just 1 minute. You can't do this. I don't care who you are with. This woman has been fired. She is no longer an employee of Metropolitan General. She is a civilian trespasser." Agent Bush finally turned his head. He didn't move his body, just his gaze, looking at Clifford over the rims of his tactical sunglasses. The look was so cold it seemed to physically push Clifford back an inch. "Doctor," Bush said, the word sounding like a threat. "Right now, this hospital is a designated federal security zone. That woman isn't an employee. She is the asset. She is the only person in a 300-mile radius with the security clearance and the specific surgical combat training required for the individual currently arriving on that roof." Bush stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Clifford's. "If you interfere with her path again, I won't ask for a termination letter. I'll have you detained under the Patriot Act for obstructing a national security operation. Am I clear, or do I need to simplify the vocabulary for you?" Clifford's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked around at his staff, the residents who had laughed at his jokes, the nurses who had followed his lead. They were all staring at him, not with respect, but with a burgeoning, horrified realization that they had spent months mocking a lion while it was trying to sleep. Exactly 3 minutes later, the locker room door opened. Ozioma Nandi stepped out, and the lobby seemed to shift on its axis. The blood-stained scrubs were gone. She wore the tailored black suit, her white shirt buttoned to the throat, her posture so upright and intentional that she seemed 3 inches taller. Her hair, once a messy bun, was now pulled back into a sleek, severe knot. She looked sleek, controlled, and utterly in command. She didn't look like someone being escorted out. She looked like the person who owned the building. Agent Bush, Ozioma said, her voice now carrying the resonance of a natural-born leader. Status on the Chief of Staff? Dr. Price is being briefed in the Situation Room, ma'am. She's already signed over full tactical and medical control of the 4th floor to you. Ozioma nodded, her eyes sweeping the room. She didn't look at Clifford with spite. She looked at him with the clinical indifference one might show a broken piece of equipment. Let's move, she commanded. We have a witness to keep alive. The Secret Service agents formed a diamond perimeter around her, their movements a blur of black suits and earpieces. As they swept toward the elevators, the staff parted like the Red Sea. Ozioma Nandi led the way, her steady, squared shoulders signaling that the time for silence was over. The asset was no longer hidden. The elevators opened on the 4th floor with a chime that sounded like a summons to war. The surgical wing, usually a bustle of soft-soled shoes and hushed whispers, had been transformed. Armed agents stood at every intersection, and the central nursing hub had been commandeered into a tactical command post. At the center of it all stood Ozioma. She was hunched over a digital terminal, the sleek fabric of her black suit catching the overhead light as she scrolled through encrypted medical files. Gone was the woman who had spent months apologizing for her own shadow. She was currently dissecting a complex radiological report with the cold, surgical detachment of a field commander. The projectile is lodged 3 millimeters from the carotid sheath, Ozioma said, her voice projecting with a resonance that silenced the room. She didn't look up as Marcus Bush and 3 other agents crowded around her. It's a specialized neurotoxin-coated round. If the casing ruptures during extraction, we aren't just looking at a surgical failure. We're looking at a localized chemical hazard. I need the ore pressurized to negative status and the ventilation isolated from the rest of the hospital. That's a tall order for a civilian facility. Ma'am, one of the agents noted, his brow furrowed. Then make it a short one, Ozioma countered, finally looking up. Her eyes were sharp, lethal, and entirely devoid of the tremor Clifford had mocked. I need the bypass machine on standby and a secondary suction line that doesn't run through the main waste tank. If Keller's heart stops, we don't have time for a committee meeting. What in God's name is going on here? The voice belonged to Dr. Eleanor Price, the Chief of Staff. She was a woman who had spent 30 years commanding respect through sheer force of will, but as she rounded the corner, she stopped dead. She looked at the agents, then at the scanners, and finally at the woman in the black suit who looked exactly like, but nothing like, the nurse she had hired 6 months ago. Ozioma, Price breathed, her voice a mix of shock and dawning realization. I just got a call from the Department of Justice telling me I've lost control of my own surgical wing. And then I see you, looking like you're ready to brief the Pentagon. Ozioma straightened her posture, offering the Chief of Staff a nod that was respectful, but unmistakably that of an equal. Dr. Price, I apologize for the disruption. The situation with Thomas Keller required a level of security and specialized intervention that your standard protocols couldn't accommodate. Standard protocols? Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes scanning Ozioma's suit and the federal detail. Ozioma, I've seen your file. You were a trauma nurse from a VA hospital in Virginia. There was nothing in there about whatever this is. My file was a curated necessity, Eleanor, Ozioma said softly. The DOJ needed a ghost in the city. Someone who could be activated if a high-value asset like Keller was compromised. I chose your hospital because it was the best, and because I thought I could disappear here. And Dr. Clifford? Eleanor asked, glancing toward the elevator where the head of surgery was currently being held at bay by a suit-clad agent. He told me he fired you for gross negligence and cowboy medicine in the trauma bay. Ozioma's expression didn't change, but the air around her seemed to grow colder. Dr. Clifford attempted to terminate a federal asset during an active mission because he didn't recognize a digital ligation when he saw one. His ego nearly cost a man his life. Right now, he is a security risk and a clinical liability. Eleanor Price looked at Ozioma, then at Agent Bush, who stood like a sentinel at her shoulder. She saw the way the federal agents looked at Ozioma, not with the casual indifference they showed the rest of the staff, but with the unwavering discipline of men following a leader they believed in. He wants to see your credentials, Eleanor said, though she already knew the answer. My credentials are in that, or, Ozioma replied, turning back to the monitors as a rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the ceiling, the sound of a heavy-lift helicopter landing on the roof. And right now, Eleanor, I'm the only one in this building who can make sure Thomas Keller lives long enough to testify. I need your best scrub tech and a clear path to or one. Everything else is secondary. Eleanor Price took a long breath, finally seeing the quiet nurse for who she truly was. The floor is yours, Commander. Just tell us what you need. Ozioma didn't waste time with a thank you. She looked at the landing pad feed on the screen. I need a scalpel, she said, her voice a steady, cold blade. And I need everyone who isn't ready for a fight to get out of my way. The heavy-lift helicopter had barely touched the roof when the stretcher hit the floor of the fourth wing. Thomas Keller was a ghost of a man, his skin the color of damp parchment, his chest hitching in shallow, desperate gasps. He was surrounded by a moving wall of tactical gear and drawn weapons, but as the team reached the double doors of Or-1, the wall opened for only one person. Ozioma was waiting. She had traded her suit jacket for a sterile gown, but the transition hadn't softened her. If anything, the blue surgical mask made her eyes look more like flint. She checked the monitor as Keller was slid onto the table, her hands moving with a speed that made the resident assistants blink. Blood pressure is bottoming out. He's into compensated shock, Ozioma announced, her voice a calm, rhythmic pulse amidst the frantic beep of the machines. I need the non-ferrous tray. Now, if a single magnetized instrument gets within 6 inches of that entry wound, the neurotoxin casing will trigger. We do this by hand and by heart. Outside the glass observation deck, a commotion erupted. Dr. Victor Clifford had finally broken past the initial security cordon, his face a mask of wounded pride and professional outrage. He reached for the handle of the scrub room door, intent on asserting his dominance one last time. This is my theater. Clifford's voice muffled through the glass, distorted but unmistakable. I am the head of surgery. You cannot bar me from a level 1 trauma procedure. That nurse is a... He didn't finish the sentence. 2 Secret Service agents, their faces as impassive as stone, stepped into his path. One of them didn't just block the door. He placed a gloved hand firmly on Clifford's chest, a physical boundary that was as absolute as a brick wall. Step back. Doctor, the agent commanded. This is a closed federal operation. You are not on the manifest. Manifest? I own the manifest. Clifford sputtered, his eyes bulging as he watched Ozioma through the glass. She didn't even look at him. She was already deep in Keller's neck, her fingers performing the same delicate, digital dance she had used in the trauma bay, but with 1,000 times more stakes. She's going to kill him. She's using field-expedient methods in a sterile environment. It's madness. It's not madness, Victor, Dr. Eleanor Price said, appearing behind him. She looked at her head of surgery with a pity that was more cutting than any insult. It's expertise you don't possess. Now be quiet and watch. You might actually learn what a real doctor looks like when the ego is stripped away. Inside the Or, the world had shrunk to the size of a 3mm gap. Ozioma felt the heat of the projectile against her fingertip, a dull, unnatural warmth. The toxin casing was pressurized. She could feel the micro-vibrations of the internal mechanism. One slip, one tremor, and the room would be flooded with an airborne nerve agent. The room was deathly silent. Even the agents inside held their breath. Ozioma's hands, the ones Clifford had mocked for shaking during morning rounds, were now as steady as the foundation of the hospital itself. She didn't use a clamp. She didn't use a probe. She used a specialized, non-reactive polymer loop, sliding it around the projectile with a grace that bordered on the supernatural. Steady, she whispered to herself, a mantra from a dozen battlefields. With a slow, agonizing pull, she extracted the round. It emerged from the tissue with a wet, sickening click. She immediately dropped it into a lead-lined containment canister held by Agent Bush. Asset is clear, Ozioma said, her voice finally breaking the tension. Start the bypass. Let's clean up this field. The monitors began to stabilize. The frantic beeping slowed into a healthy, rhythmic thrum. Keller's color began to return. Ozioma stepped back. Her gown splattered with the blood of a man who would now live to bring down an empire. She looked up at the observation glass, meeting Clifford's gaze. She didn't gloat. She didn't wave. She simply stared at him until he was the one who had to look away. The quiet nurse had saved the day, and the head of surgery was left standing in the hallway. clutching a termination letter that was now nothing more than a scrap of paper in a world that had moved past him. The heavy silence of or one was broken only by the rhythmic, healthy hiss of the ventilator. Ozioma stepped away from the table, peeling off her blood-stained gloves with a slow, deliberate snap. She looked at Thomas Keller, now stabilized and under the watchful eyes of the Secret Service medical detail, before turning toward the automatic doors. As the glass slid open, the hallway felt like a vacuum. Dr. Victor Clifford was still there, flanked by Dr. Price and a dozen stunned staff members. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago, his pristine white coat now appearing like an ill-fitting costume. The arrogance that had been his armor for decades had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow, trembling man who couldn't quite meet Ozioma's gaze. Ozioma walked directly up to him. She didn't stop until she was inches from his face, forcing him to reckon with the woman he had tried to discard. The black suit she wore seemed to absorb the hospital's harsh lights, making her presence feel monolithic. The projectile was extracted, Ozioma said, her voice a calm, low-frequency vibration that commanded the entire corridor. The neurotoxin was contained. The witness will survive to testify. Clifford swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. I was following protocol, Nandi. You have to understand. The liability of such an unorthodox. Stop, Ozioma interrupted, not with a shout, but with a quiet finality that was far more devastating. That is your failure, Victor. You see medicine as a set of mechanics, a series of levers and gears governed by a manual. You spent so much time polishing the machine that you forgot why we built it in the first place. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her hospital ID badge. The plastic card, once a symbol of her attempt at a quiet life, looked trivial in her hand. You mocked my silence because you thought it was a lack of knowledge, she continued, her eyes boring into his. But silence is where the work happens. It's where you listen to the patient instead of your own ego. You tried to fire me because you couldn't control me. But you never realized I was the only thing standing between your hospital and a catastrophe you weren't equipped to handle. She took his hand, the same hand that had waved the termination letter, and pressed the badge into his palm. Here is your badge back. And here is your lesson. Humility is the first step of a true physician. Until you learn that, you aren't a healer. You're just a mechanic with a title. Clifford stood frozen, his fingers curling instinctively around the plastic badge. He looked at Dr. Price. But the chief of staff simply crossed her arms, her silence offering Ozioma her full endorsement. Ozioma turned to Agent Marcus Bush, who stood at the end of the hall like a sentinel. Agent Bush, the transition is complete. My team will handle the post-op transport to the secure facility. The convoy is ready. Ma'am, Bush replied, snapping a sharp salute that echoed off the sterile walls. Ozioma didn't look back at the oar, nor at the residents who were now watching her with a mixture of awe and shame. She walked toward the elevators, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the tile. She had arrived at Metropolitan General as a ghost, seeking a place to hide from the noise of her past. She was leaving as a legend, reminding everyone that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one to underestimate. As the elevator doors slid shut, the last thing Clifford saw was the calm, unreadable face of Lieutenant Commander Ozioma Nandi. The quiet nurse was gone, and in her wake, she had left a hospital that would never look at a pair of scrubs the same way again. Outside, the sirens began to wail once more, and the black SUVs pulled away, disappearing into the city like shadows returning to the night.